Hello and welcome to Tomorrow's People podcast, brought to you by the Future HR Academy, hosted by me, Perry Timms, and proudly sponsored by Personio. Today, we've got a bit of a celebrity who's normally on the other side of the microphone. So if you know anything about talent acquisition, if you know anything about recruitment, you will probably have come across something called recruitment brain food. And that's the brainchild and, dare I say it, the vehicle with which the wonderful Hung Lee comes to us today.
Thank you very much, Perry. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here.
Great. And you are normally on the other side of the mic, right? You are normally the host.
That's right. It's an interesting experience to have a switch of positions. And I'm looking forward to how that plays out. Probably it's not something I'm used to.
Good stuff. Well, we're going to find out a little bit more about you. So we've got some themes that we've asked all our guests on this podcast to share. So the Hung Lee story to now. So I'm interested in kind of what got you here. How did you find your way to having one of the most kind of enormous communities in the talent acquisition and recruitment world? A few of the highlights of that journey.
Recruiting brain food really emerged as an attempt to solve a problem I had.
Right.
And the problem I had was that there was just so much noise in the internet.
Okay.
So much stuff out there. I knew the quality of content was available, stuff that would enrich what I was doing, but it was just high effort in order to find that. It seemed that you had to click on 10 things to get the one thing that actually added a bit of value. Essentially, I got to a point where I started collecting items that were really good. I might have been a sort of a taxonomist in a previous life, and I ended up tagging things in such a way that made it like findable and searchable. And before you know it, I had a really useful set of useful set of resources that I delved into time and again.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me that if I had that problem, then other people might also have that problem, and that very quickly went to how can I get that to other people in some way? Yeah. And I thought, why not I just do a newsletter? Yeah. And that can, if people are interested in this type of stuff, then great. If not, also great. But I'm doing it anyway for me, so I'm going to keep cracking through it.
Fantastic. And within that world that you're in now, I guess there's high expectations and increasing noise and traffic to get through. What's kind of challenging you at the moment in the work you're doing?
It probably is the routine.
Right.
It's probably the routine. It is one of these where, so one of the things that I do and subscribes to the newsletter, and people who watch the podcast and what have you, watch the live stream, should I say, they'll know that it's very regular. Yeah. And the cadence is very, very consistent. So every Sunday, 7:30, this goes out as a newsletter. Every Friday at 2 p.m, there's a video live stream. Yeah. And now there's other things as well. Right. Monday, there's also Thursday now, new things happening and all this stuff. So anyway, regularity is part of the how I do it. Yeah. But that also means that there's basically every week there's 2 or 3 deadlines that can't move. And I've found that I've had to change, like I have to squeeze my life into those bits around it. And that can sometimes be difficult if you're traveling.
Yeah, for sure.
I remember I was in Australia earlier this year on a 4-week journey.
Wow.
And a lot of that was like traveling to different places, big country. Yeah. I was working out of the back of cars and stuff like that. As people were driving and enjoying the scenery, I was like typing stuff out. So the routine is tough, and it kind of creates an inflexibility, which is the biggest challenge for sure.
And I think what a lot of people appreciate, because I see it being shared on social, is that you curate stuff that is so useful to people beyond recruitment and talent acquisition. So your readership and followership is actually pretty broad, isn't it? You've got a lot of followers from different disciplines.
I've got followers from all kinds of different disciplines, different parts of the world. But one thing I found, Perry, is that some of the best content actually comes from outside of industry. Right. There's a lot of problems out there that basically other industries or other disciplines have got an idea or a solution or a framework to,
Yeah.
and it could easily be transposed and applied to what we're doing in TA.
Yeah.
So I don't make a deliberate point
No.
to seek it out,
Right.
but it seems obvious to me now that I've got the lens on when I'm
Yeah.
reading something in nature or
Yeah.
I'm reading some
Yeah.
physics thing, that hang on,
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
applies how we assess things.
Yeah.
And then you drop it in, and so that helps spark a few conversations and hopefully get the grey matter going.
Totally that. And it lives up to its name, right? Brain food. That's exactly what you're trying to do. So I have to thank you for connecting me to Azeem Azhar and his work, because without that, I wouldn't have one of my most quotable examples about AlphaFold protein technology. So thank you for that. Now, what's really interesting for me now is where you're headed. What do you want to do with either recruiting Brain Food and just anything else with Hungly Inc. attached to it? Where are you going?
This will surprise a lot of people, but the truth is there's no objective.
Okay.
There is no target. There is no objective, and that's true from the beginning of Brain Food. Right, when I started the newsletter 6 years ago, 6 years ago now, there wasn't a plan. No. Right, it was just, hey, listen, this might be useful. Yeah. And that's still the guiding sort of value in everything I'm doing. So I don't think there's an end game. There's no exit. There's no plan to do anything of that type. My driver is, look, is it possible for me to create more spaces where good conversations can happen and quality connections can occur in the recruiting and HR spaces? And that I see as a little bit of my mission now, because as things have rolled on, I am aware there's an audience there, and potentially I can help in a way that other people can't. Yeah. So my motivation is to say, right, where else can that ecosystem need a bit of support, and then do something that might help that.
It's literally a sense of social capital, isn't it? There's an enormous amount of social capital that you've created with it as a kind of brand and a concept, and it is, by the sounds of it, what else can you do with that in terms of reach and touch and connection?
The ideas of how you apply the social capital is actually not difficult.
Right.
It's very easy to come up with new ideas and think, yeah, that would be great. So I think the what next isn't a difficult question. Yeah. It's just a matter of aligning the what you do with what the central the North Star is, which is to create mental stimulation, encourage the community, the recruiting and TA community, get them inspired. They've got important jobs to do. We've got important jobs to do. But it's a hard job.
Yeah, totally.
It can be a very, very difficult job, mentally difficult. So I see my job now as basically supporting that ecosystem.
Brilliant. And within that, I mean, one of the things I've noticed is that you can table some pretty controversial subjects yourself, and either you host them on the live show or you comment on them within what's going on, I suppose, in the newsletter and beyond. Yet you seem to really navigate that without any damage being done to you by creating a controversial frame of reference. That's what I've noticed anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a sense of responsibility when you have an audience, right?
Okay.
And the responsibility for me is not to avoid the tough conversations, but to kind of create the space where that can happen in a safe context. Yeah. Because if we don't have the conversation in a safe space, somebody else is going to have it in an unsafe space, and that's no bueno. No. So I try to create a situation where you can debate it. Sometimes I adopt or exaggerate a position in order to stimulate the conversation. Yeah. But then I try to not impose. Like, I have no interest in imposing my own view to people. Yeah. And the reason for that, is generally because I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. Yeah. Like I literally have no conviction whether this is correct. It's my best guess. Right. Yeah. And I think everyone's just best guessing. Nice. Yeah. What we've got to do though is create a situation where those best guesses can kind of connect with each other, and can we learn something from that connection? Yeah.
Yeah, you do seem very deliberate in a nice way about the people you get on the show, as in balance different perspectives, different experiences. So that must be a very deliberate thing for you to try and get that sort of perspectives right.
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing I try to avoid is too much moralizing or
Right.
too much advocacy.
Okay.
Right. I'm tired of people basically saying do better.
Right.
You know,
Like-
you hear this a lot in recruiting. Yeah, do better on DEI, or
Yeah.
hey, listen, like it's a moral failure if you've got like
Yeah.
some sort of thing. Oftentimes it isn't.
Yeah.
You know, oftentimes a lot of people trying really hard, but there's like
Yeah.
legitimate issues,
Yeah.
systemic problems that
Yeah.
cause that thing not to happen.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't think it's valuable to hector people.
Right.
It usually has a counterproductive effect anyway.
Yeah.
What we want to do is expose the challenge and then understand why this is difficult.
Yeah.
And then through the dialogue, something will emerge that might help.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost like an emergent way of trying to find the solution rather than come in there with the conviction you have the answer and your job is to batter everyone into submission. I'm tired of that. I think there's too much of that online. And I'm not saying I can neutralize it, but on the stuff I'm doing, I make sure that's not happening.
It's a good point, because communities are normally brought together because they have a common interest. And I guess what happens in that is that you find then there are deviances from some aspects of the common interest, right? So it is largely a talent acquisition community, isn't it? But you're right, it's quite broad. But within that, you get some people, and I'll just use this as an illustration, who are very anti it being anywhere near HR, as an example. And some people who are very like, no, it's nuts. You have to have talent acquisition within HR because it's people. And so there is something, isn't there, about how you keep that community focused on what matters rather than the disparate views and the little cliques and stuff.
Yeah, I think the key to this is to make sure everyone feels that their views are respected, and there's some sort of some clear rules you got to apply to say, look, you know, I'm a big fan, not a fan. I think I'm a certain believer that you need to have a very permissive attitude to free speech, for instance. And the reason for this is once you start policing that, it can be it's a slippery slope that you have to really watch, because who then is the person saying that is okay or not okay to say. So generally permissive, but it's got to be respectful.
Yeah, sure.
Right. There's nobody coming in and insulting people or. You know, having arguments online is just counterproductive. Everyone knows that. If you've been involved in an argument, you'd know it yourself. So can you say something with respect, and then can that trigger a valuable conversation? I hope we would try to do that. I think it's important we do it rather than intimidate people in not speaking up, because that will manifest in a different way, probably in a negative way if you repress it in that way.
And you talking to all of those principles reminds me of a lot of communities I've been in the past. I mean, I go back to the earlier days of like Twitter and groups and hashtags and so on. And I remember a phrase that I've used several times in blog posts that you gave me at the event with James and Gordon at the Recruitment Network. And you coined the phrase small social. You said that at that event. I remember it distinctly. And I've held on to that very tightly, because I think, you just gave me something I've been looking for, which was I was getting a bit jaded by the wide open space of Twitter and everything else. And what I'm seeing in the Recruiting Brain Food community particularly is that you have contained it nicely, if that's the right way to think about it, but you haven't controlled how it operates. And people have, and I've seen this because I've watched live broadcasts and I've seen the chat and I've seen the threads and the posts that you put out. People have got that respect for it. You've created it as a respected entity, I think.
I think people want to preserve it.
Right.
So even the ones that have been on the wrong end of, you know, a conversation, this, that, or the other, or have encountered, let's say, a view that they objected to strongly, even those people, I think, would recognize, you know what, it's better to have this space where there is some sort of peace going on. It's almost like that hotel in John Wick, you know. There's like there's no hits taking place in this hotel. As soon as you walk in, you put your no one's getting assassinated here. You can do all that stuff outside, and then people want to come in here, and then you open up the aperture, and that's for me what inclusion is. You know, you want to try and get people in that have different views, and it's from different views that we're able to challenge our own perspectives and strengthen them and temper them and improve them.
Yeah.
So I don't see anything getting improved through echo chambers.
No, right.
We need to constantly, rub up against stuff that we don't quite agree with.
And I think there's a lot for listeners and viewers out there to think about that, because I've found myself very comfortable in echo chambers thinking they don't agree with what I'm all about, whether it's self-management or whatever. Therefore, I'm going to discount their views and I'm going to go to more of those people who agree with me. And then I've realised, like, well, how dull is that? And how unstretching of the mind does that become? So
there's a very challenging continuum, right? Between and not many people talk about this, but we might as well sort of launch it here. But we all agree about the concept of safe spaces, right? We all think that's really important, because a safe space for me is you are able to disagree with someone without
Totally
repercussion, right?
Yeah.
However, a safe space can easily turn into a comfort zone.
Yes.
Where it is something that you're super comfortable with, totally relaxed. You're no longer caring so much about what you say, because nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then comfort zone can very easily segue into echo chamber.
Yeah.
Where actually you can say hard things, but nothing's ever going to come back, because everyone else is in the same view. And if you're in the echo chamber, at the same time, emotionally, that's very validating, because you can say something quite powerful, and you'll get people saying, giving you applause, and that can just strengthen your opinion on something that might be erroneous. Because if you had exposure outside of that chamber, outside of that safe space, outside of that comfort zone, you might actually have some people rightly challenging that strong view. So we have to be careful about being overly safe.
True. And whilst we're not going to pick apart or, wholly endorse psychological safety, Amy Edmondson concept, etc., we kind of get it for all the reasons you've talked about. And one of the tenets of that is that you call out violations, as you rightly said. So it's really nice to hear that people have such respect for a community they want it to become the safe space where you can be disagreeable. But there's a line still to cross, and if that happens,
and I honestly saying I don't think I'm particularly good at managing that line. I'm very permissive generally. Probably overly too. There's much better community managers than me for sure. I always sort of joke that I'm actually a pretty bad recruiter, because I generally want the best for people all the time. I'm rooting for the candidate. In the same way, in a community, I'm rooting for the transgressor in some way.
Sure.
So, all right, he says something terrible, but do I come down with a big hammer? Yes, no. And it's like, let's give him another chance. But it's a hard line to judge, and it is a bit art and science. You got to just read the room a little bit. I wish I could do it better. I'm working on that.
I think there's something, isn't there, when and if you did have to yield the big stick, people kind of realise and go, well, that must be bad, because you never yield the big stick unnecessarily, right?
Yeah, and probably I should more visibly now and again, just signal across. But then that kind of really chafes against my own character, which is never to try and be an authoritarian, right? That can easily go into being a dictatorial style of things. That's not my natural way. So there's some failings there in terms of, I could probably learn to do that without feeling like a dictator, and maybe need to do that a little bit more.
But I've seen a lot of communities, especially wrapped around institutions, and by that I mean like professional bodies, and they do become very caustic and really dangerous and harsh, and a lot of people just back away from them because there's no value.
We've all been in communities where clique has developed, and that clique turns into a bullying clique.
Exactly.
Oftentimes they end up, because they're prominent members of the community, they end up getting elevated into sometimes official roles, the moderators, the managers, etc. And then you're as just a member of the group, you'll just find yourself, hang about. That's unfair. They've literally overreached their authority, but then there's no way to correct that because the system doesn't have it. So probably I've always got that in the back of my mind, and it's always like, look, listen, you don't want to create a situation where you become a clique, or you are a clique, or you kind of are abusing your bureaucratic authority that you have within just as a manager of the group.
Too right. My suspicion is the community would let you know if you were being too authoritarian or a little bit laissez-faire. So let's hope that continues. But in the community that is talent acquisition, recruitment, and the general sort of, I guess, largest constituency which form your community, I mean, it's a tough game right now. Perhaps tougher than in many years. Are you seeing a sense of togetherness and problem solving communally, or are people really head down and can't do it? What's your current kind of take on that community?
I would say we're very confused.
Right.
We're very confused. I'm very confused.
Yeah.
Because we're getting all kind. Firstly, the last couple of years have been crazy, right?
Yeah.
So everyone's been part of that. We don't need to tell anybody how crazy the world is.
No.
But that entire sort of period has just been an oscillation.
Yeah.
It's been random and it's been disorientating.
Yeah, good word.
And I think this year has matched every other year, the last couple of years previously, disorientating. So right now, for instance, we marched into this year as recruiters feeling, wow, it's going to be a big growth year.
Yeah.
Everyone's like piling in cash. We've got massive growth plans, etc. Boom. We have conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We have sort of a very significant backlash in terms of sanctions, economic, whatever.
Yeah.
Suddenly that saps the energy out of and the optimism out of this growth sort of vision that we had, and it gets pulled back. Now we're in a situation of high inflation.
Yep.
We've got a lot of high-profile tech layoffs.
Yeah.
A lot of VCs starting to pull back and be defensive.
Yeah.
And that looks, it looks difficult. On the other hand, are we over-indexing on some of these high-profile cases, which at the end of the day don't actually constitute a large number of the roles that are employed? If you look at software engineering in particular, is one of the barometers. A lot of the layoffs have happened in tech companies, tech scale-ups, but actually, in terms of the numbers of people they employ, is actually quite a small number.
Yeah.
And I think recruiting is still going on in a growth phase for a lot of other segments in the industry. It's confusing though. Like no one's got a good read.
Yeah.
And we've just got to try and again take best guesses as to where we're at.
We have, and only this week I've seen conflicting evidence from an analyst and from a media publication about whether recession is absolutely likely or not, and how deep or harsh it will be. So you're right. There's no line of sight for this, is there? So I guess we're sort of sensing our way to maybe what's nearer to us, shorter cycles, perhaps of progression that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think we basically have to embrace the ambiguity of it, and understand that the sense of security we had through predictability is no longer something we can ever think about. I mean, I think the world, in terms of the deep macro systems that really drive change, those things are in disequilibrium. And that for me is accelerating, and it means that we'll continually to oscillate. We'll have more disorientation. The people that win individually and the organizations that win collectively are the ones that are able to basically deal with the disorientating environment.
I mean, that, if anything, is a really good kind of point to make right now for people listening to this. If you can handle the disorientation, not get seasick and not perhaps overly lurch towards one dynamic or another, if you're sensible and tuned in, and you'd still need to be risky and experimental, right? I think there's probably a lesson there for whatever size organisation we're talking about. Yeah, that's a really good point.
This podcast is brought to you by Personio. Personio is the all-in-one HR solution for now and the future. We help HR teams recruit, onboard, manage, pay, and develop employees more efficiently, and our easy-to-use solution works across every part of the employee lifecycle. Automate your people processes and gain time back for more impactful work, like creating your people strategy. After all, everything starts with people. To find out what Personio can do for you and your business, head to personio.com. That's PERSONIO.com.
And as you say, if the recruitment community and the whole work community are a bit confused, I've heard reports from people saying, I've never had to work so hard on a sourcing requirement because of candidate ghosting, because of people, outbidding and all sorts of other things like that. So it feels like it's a quite bare knuckle environment at the moment. I mean, I don't know whether that's right or not.
There's no question that candidate or job seeker behavior has massively changed over the last couple of years.
Right.
I think there's a couple of ways to think about this. I think firstly, the sense of loyalty that all of us have to our employers has been seriously degraded over the COVID period. We had millions of people let go.
Yeah.
Like millions, tens of millions of people globally were let go and made redundant. And how that was handled meant that, people will think, okay, there is no such thing as job security. Therefore, I'm going to have different standards next time I look at a job.
Yeah.
Second big trend was obviously shift to remote. People who didn't lose their jobs, but they kept their jobs and actually shifted remote. Turns out a lot of us enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Turns out a lot of us realized, wow, I've been spending, 2 hours a day, every day doing this commute. I ain't never doing that again.
Yeah.
So we've got elevated candidate expectations now, along with sort of disaffection with loyalty to employer. And the third theme that I think has changed candidate behavior is this disorientation that we're seeing now, which risk aversion has gone up.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So what does it mean to quit my job now and join this company when I am hearing about recession? I see Snap has just let go 20%. I see no ending of conflict. I see escalations in different places in the world. I better stay where I am. So I think those things make it extremely difficult to get engagement, extremely difficult to get candidates through process, extremely difficult to get them to commit to change. And add in like another factor, which of course is completely changed the game, is the way in which we're building trust with candidates has also changed.
Right.
Bear in mind, pre-COVID, only 3 years ago, that trust building would be through multiple face-to-face meetings, probably a couple of nights out, understanding who the people were, and then that's all trust building. Kind of that's all gone now.
Wow.
Like people doing the shift to remote has digitized a lot of those events. And those events are obviously great for efficiency purposes and what have you, but the price to pay there is exactly that lack of social exchange and relationship building.
So I guess we've got some rewiring and reimagining and reinvention to do within the industry. Have you seen any alternative techniques to the usual kind of hiring routines that you've looked at and gone, wow, if we could replicate that, that solves our problem because it's strongly aligned, it's still candidate-led, but it's, more balanced and fair. Have you seen anything where you kind of look at it and go, wow?
There's some extreme examples which are very interesting. So if you look at the edges of, wow, these guys have actually done it type of thing, then you think, wow, that's interesting. So I'll give you a couple. So firstly, I think companies that have gone to, certain companies have entirely abandoned the idea of doing any assessment.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yep.
So think about this. They've basically accepted assessments are all fundamentally flawed.
Right.
And you can never actually accurately figure out whether this person is going to be good at the job, because the job is going to be performed in context. Yeah. And the context can't be replicated by some sort of exercise. Yeah. So if you want the job, there's the job.
Right.
So it's called open hiring.
Okay.
And the way in which this works is simply you have a looser agreement in terms of termination. It's like, listen, if you want the job, just turn up and you start. And you start the job, you get on with it, and then there's
like progress checks. And,
there's agreements to say, look, is this the appropriate thing or not? So far, this type of recruiting has only been done in, let's say, more manual work.
Okay.
So I think Boots did it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but some retailers have done it, and some other businesses of that type. And I think it's a really interesting experiment because it kind of recognizes that the recruiting rituals that we all go through may actually be more performative than they are productive. So are we actually getting anything from, what are we trying to achieve with these 10 interviews? Are we just, we're probably just trying to build up confidence to make a risk.
Exactly.
When in fact, just make the risk a bit cheaper. So there's that way of doing it.
Cool. Yeah.
Other ways, how about completely automated recruiting process with zero human recruiters involved? Amazon famously tried this, and I think they are still doing it for certain roles. Whereby it's just a series of self-selections. So that you go through a digital exercise that's entirely automated, which suits on brand to if you've ever been to an Amazon Fresh, that example, imagine that ethos into recruiting where the candidate goes in and basically can figure out whether they want it or not. So a few exercises that test them whether they have the right traits, and then boom, they're in. So radical experimentation, right? And I think right now there's lots of companies that are doing things of that type, which is a very exciting moment to be in recruiting and
I can
HR.
imagine. Yeah, and it will frighten some people. But I suppose when we look at the SME market particularly, a lot of that is done on relationships and trials and not necessarily convoluted 8-point exercises and so on. And if you look at, kind of numbers, the SME community makes up a huge part of the UK workforce provision, I suppose. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I suppose the other thing I'm thinking about, and you have already alluded to a lot of this, is you seem to have a real fascination with technology. You are talking about technology a lot, both in commentating on the sort of titans like what Google, Meta, and everybody else are doing, and so that, I suppose, segue or intersection between people and technology, you seem to have a real interest in. If you were a betting person, are you putting your chips in any kind of thing? Are you thinking about metaverse, or what's kind of catching your attention as where you think technology is playing a really big part in change and shift?
I'm really interested in some of the smaller solutions,
right?
Because sometimes we can get lost in the big dreams and the big visions. I'll say a little bit on metaverse.
Okay.
I'm a fan of the concept, and
Right.
I'm a backer of Zuckerberg for his ambition.
Right.
And I've got an Oculus, and it is an amazing thing.
Okay.
However, I've tried to do work stuff in an Oculus, and you know what? It took me about half an hour to navigate the coffee table.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I couldn't do it. It's more inefficient.
Yeah.
So I have my doubts.
Yeah. Okay.
Even though I can see the application
Yeah,
for
sure.
training. We've already training things like pilots and stuff
Yeah.
like this on Oculus.
Yeah.
The NFL is training
Yeah.
a lot of their elite athletes
Yeah.
using Oculus.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to be
Yeah.
said for, when you've got a complicated environment to look at. Yeah, we can train on that.
Yeah.
Whether you collaborate on it, don't know.
Good. Yeah.
But yeah, some of the point solutions I think are very interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been really big on recently is this concept of interview intelligence, interview analytics. So this is the idea that, the hidden problem we had, which you didn't know pre-COVID, was that when we set up an interview, two people would go into an interview, both would leave, and they'd report on what happened, and we'd just have to accept that was the case.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So hiring manager says this, candidate says that, two different stories.
Yeah.
It's like the Rashomon effect.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to deal with that as a recruiter? You have no clue, right?
Right.
It's one of these where the manager says, not strong enough.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, move on. Get me another candidate.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, that was a problem of the analog era.
Okay.
Because no one could record.
Right.
It would be very conspicuous to put a tape recorder in.
Yeah, sure.
That wouldn't work. But these days, with a remote video interview, that's a digital experience,
Of course,
which means there's data there that can be used.
Right.
So interview intelligence is about mining the metadata from that interview.
Okay. Yeah.
Meaning, how long was that interview?
Right.
How many times did Perry interrupt that particular candidate? Why does Perry seem to interrupt this demographic of candidate more than the other candidate?
Nice.
How come he is saying yes more to this person than that type of person? So you can start tracking how interview behaviors are occurring.
Yeah.
Now, the purpose of this could be used to, browbeat managers.
Of course.
But no.
Yeah.
The idea is to try and train managers.
Yeah,
So it's a
sure.
training issue. So that if you're a hiring manager just new to interviewing, this thing can tell you, hey, listen, what's happened is you've interrupted this amount of time, and we found over the course of doing this work that the most effective interviewers interrupt less, and actually that produces more high quality performers as a result of that. So as a training lesson, we need to teach you a little bit about how not to interrupt. So yeah, interview intelligence, interview analytics.
Very nice.
I think it's going to be a big thing. Should be mandatory in a couple of years, I would imagine.
And I like how you positioned it, that it wasn't anything to do with, like you say, browbeating managers, because, I've done it as well. Lots of roads point to manager failure. And in fact, Gallup recently said, do you know what? We've been capturing engagement data for a long time. And do you know what the biggest differentiator is? Whether you get on with your manager or not. It's like, oh, duh, really? We knew this. Anyway, but what I like about what you described was where technology kind of augments how we see the world, how we interact, and how we present what we do, that we can't always spot in ourselves, right? And even if it is a little bit of a bias, we might be aware of it and think, no, I can overcome that. But actually, your behaviour tells otherwise. So something really nice about that. And it reminds me of the whole concept of people kind of having programmable technology to work with them. Are you seeing some of that come through? Not quite the centaur role, half person, half tech, but that we can deploy technology and almost code it for us and with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, the idea of augmented recruiting, I think, is exactly the right sort of way to frame it. Recruiters, I think there's still a lot of recruiters that are very resistant or hostile to technology because they see it as a threat.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah,
and to some degree, the threat is that perception is not inaccurate.
Yeah,
because probably there'll be less recruiting resource required.
Yeah,
but at the same time, you can imagine that the work will get better because the tooling is going to help get you to have better outcomes.
Yeah.
For me, it's very similar to something like VAR.
Yeah.
Where there's some obvious moments where you should deploy that technology.
Totally.
And at the end of the day, what should happen is that the right decision gets made.
Exactly.
And after the first kind of year or two where people complain about it, we all recognize that actually this has improved the quality of decision making. That has a knock-on effect, which means players get less irate because they can, they know this is fair. There's less fouls, there's less antagonism, better football.
Yeah.
So
agreed.
I think technology's relationship is in recruiting will be very, very similar.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me to something that could be useful for people watching this, which is almost like, predictions for the future are great, but what would you advise people to bring near to them and start working on now? What would be your kind of Hung Lee 3 tips for navigating the autumn into 23? Whether you're in TA, recruitment, or just anything to do with the world of work, what were the kind of 3 things you would urge people to be mindful of or apply and do?
I would say it's essential that people really focus on their own network value.
Right.
So network value is simply, it's a similar idea to social capital.
Yep.
But it's the idea that, look, what is the power of your network that can aid you in your job, your career, your life?
Yeah.
And I think too many people are trying to solve it all by themselves. Right? They're literally trying to solve it all themselves. Guess what? If you've got a massive network that can help you solve these problems, it's actually going to be super valuable for you.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why this is important is because we don't know what we need to know.
True.
If we agree that the world is going to be continually disorganized and chaotic, we actually don't know what the next valuable skill might be.
Completely.
So you can train yourself in this and then find out actually it's obsolete by the time the world changes.
Yeah.
What's better in terms of your spend of resources is, can you build a network that can help you get to that new skill when you need it?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And I think that's something in the near future we're going to start recruiting for.
Yeah.
So right now we only recruit for individuals.
Yeah.
We assess for individuals, right?
Yeah.
We don't assess for whether that person's network value is there.
Wow.
Maybe on certain roles we do at sales.
Yeah.
We probably covertly think, has he got a black book?
Exactly.
But that concept is going to be applied across no matter what job you're doing.
Yeah.
Because I assure you, let's say a software engineer previously would think, this job's a solo thing. Why does he need connect? Tell you what, that software engineer will tap his network or her network in order to find a solution faster than just sitting there trying to batter your way through it.
Totally right.
So network value, number one.
Love that.
Second thing I would advise people to do is really understand that they need to close the gap between what they do and how they appear. In other words, we are in a world where it's not as almost the opposite side of network value is they're the people that you can lean on, but do enough people know who you are and what it is you do?
Okay, right.
So old school, we might call this personal branding. But even though that's an unfashionable term these days, I do think that that's a hidden value because we're living in a world where the one-to-one connections, the relationship building isn't quite there anymore.
True.
But people still are going to feel more comfortable dealing with you if they have some kind of feeling as to who you are.
Yeah.
And I've learned this through doing Brain Food, by the way.
Right, okay.
Where, I've been humbled by the amount of people that would have positive feelings towards me.
Yeah.
Even though I've never I don't know who they are.
No, you haven't done anything for them, or
But I don't feel I've done anything personally for them, but they feel that I have.
Okay.
And that means that I can actually call upon them to help with whatever.
Fantastic.
And I've realized, first, that's very humbling. But secondly, I've realized that's actually really valuable.
Yeah.
Because you can mobilize a bunch of people that can help you when you need it. And again, I'm thinking about a turbulent world where potentially people find themselves economically insecure suddenly without expectation. Both of those things, I think, will help you sort that out.
So there's some real lessons there, isn't there? In almost like the collective intelligence you can get from your network, so the value there and the diversification. I think there's a lovely point around that. And it reminds me of that whole kind of cliche of not what you know, but who you know, but in a very, very specifically like functional way. And then I think that's really important what you've added there, which is, what do people know you for? What's your rep in a way of not just how do you show up as a kind, compassionate soul? Because I think that's obviously something we would all like to be associated with. However, it's almost like, what do you stand for? What do you do? What value do you create? And where can I go to if that's what I need? You're the sort of person to leverage and create that. It feels like it's personal brand, but with a real slant on impact, though.
Yeah, personal brand is no longer the sort of term I want to use for this. But it's the closest approximate. It's more a case where you've got to help the person who doesn't know you.
Yeah.
You've got to help them get beyond who this thing is. So it is about branding. It is about trying to connect your capability, your value with who you are. Yeah. Otherwise, you're going to have to do the hard yards and resell yourself at every contact point. Understand that if you, let's say, are not visible online in any way, that when you are encountering a new person for the first time, they've got nothing to work on.
No,
right? You've got to just basically build from the scratch everything that's there. That seems to be a lot of work.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're out there in some way, you've actually pre-built a lot of this effort. So it's almost like you're helping people trust you more by by externalizing a lot of who you are.
Yeah. Kind of reputation, presence. Yeah, that kind of thing. Like it. Hung, that's brilliant. I'm all out of questions, but I did want to turn it around to you and just say, is there one thing I haven't asked you that you'd like to share with me or viewers, watchers?
Oh, wow. I mean, is there a question that hasn't been asked? I should be. There's probably a million of them.
Yeah.
I actually can't think of one right now, to be honest with you.
That's all right.
Yeah.
That's all right. But I think if we come back to the network value and what you stand for, I think it's obvious to me watching your work grow over the last few years. And I've got to give you a shout out because during COVID, you did that 24-hour brain food where you were on it for 24 hours, weren't you? You didn't sleep, did you?
I didn't know. I'm still paying for it now.
That's epic.
I'm still paying for it now.
That's so epic.
It was so. I remember because I had helped to do it in the sense of back office people.
Yeah.
They were so enthusiastic. They were saying, let's do it again next year. I said, no chance.
Yeah.
Because that was painful.
Moment in time as well.
But it was important.
It was, wasn't it?
That was just to put people into a bit of context. But essentially, just after the lockdown started happening and redundancies were occurring, I noticed, being a person that sends a lot of email to a lot of recruiters, lots of out of offices, bounce back saying this person's left, this person's resigned, this person's no longer there. And I just thought, wow, a lot of our community's losing work here. And I just thought, you know what? They must be feeling in really desperate straits, suddenly lost their job. No ending lockdown. We don't know when this is over. Lots of panic. And I just felt, you know what? We got to try and do something to just connect the community together. Why don't I just do a stunt of some stupid type? And I think you came on, did you, Perry? You're amazing. Again, example of calling upon the network. So many amazing people came in to give talks. We had 40 talks running. Turned into like a massive event, broke the online system because it literally froze at 8,000 people live streaming, couldn't go anymore. And it was the stunt, because sometimes you need a stunt. It was me sitting there for 24 hours going through it.
I know, I remember. So that's a bit of an epic thing. But yes, so what you're known for is that sense of community. I think that curiosity and curation, which you, by your own admission, you started because you wanted to and get through the noise, and you've made that such an accessible thing for other people. So I think they would recognize you as a bit of a kind of curator source for them. But I think it is also that positivity that you talk about in a way that's very balanced, but you're looking for what's the good outcome that can come from here. So I think there's always something in that. that. So let's hope that people listening to this and watching this are inspired, are wanting to think about more communal, collective and shared accountable success, and can pick up Recruiting Brain Food and all the other great things that you do. But thanks from Personio, thanks from the Future HR Academy and me, Hung, for just a really interesting dive into the now, next and whatever. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Perry.
Cheers.